Now, I don't want to alarm anybody, but I think we can actually do a July reading wrap up. And if you are new here, this is notable because while this is a channel about books and book adjacent things, I have been in a kind of reading funk, not like a full slump, but we haven't done a wrap up of what I've read in a month, which is something we generally do monthly, since like March. And I think I'm finally finding my groove again. And I meant to go back and do that second quarter reading wrap up, but it kind of feels like we've just missed it at this point. So I don't know that I'm going to swing back, but I do want to talk about July. So hi, my name is Melody. We're gonna do that. And if you are interested in my thoughts on books on a more regular basis, ideally monthly, I would love if you stuck around and hung out more regularly, whether it is subscribing or just dropping in whenever you feel like it. But let's go ahead and jump into my July. Now, I'm actually going to start with something that I read at the tail end of June, or reread, I should say, because I reread My Lady Jane, which I hadn't read since it came out, in preparation for the show that came out on Amazon Prime. And we talked about that more in depth as well, though in just as chaotic a format as the book is. But I had just forgotten, like I knew that I really enjoyed this book, but I forgot how fun it was, how refreshing it was when it came out. It has spawned a lot of subsequent books, and I need to both finish the Jane series and the Mary series, which is finishing up this month with a new release. But I had just forgotten that this is such a fun time. I mean, I knew, but it was a nice reminder, and it was fun to watch the television show that was almost a surprise to me. I had forgotten it was in development. It felt like the promo reached me very late in the game. So I'm glad I was able to reread, to watch the show. If you have enjoyed the show and haven't yet read the book, I would highly recommend it. Or if you read the book and haven't checked out the show, vice versa. But it was just a fun time. Next, I did read a new graphic novel that I talked about in an anticipated releases video, Tristan and Lancelot, A Tale of Two Knights, an Arthurian Love Story by James Persichetti and L.S. Beeler, or Byler. And this is exactly what you would expect. It is a kind of adventure romance graphic novel set around the Arthurian legend. It did take me a second because it says Tristan very clearly on the cover, but it took my brain a moment to catch up and realize that this was Tristan of Tristan and Isolde, not necessarily, I mean, I don't know where the overlap on the Arthurian legend is there, to be completely honest, but that was another story that was being brought into the mix, because this does follow these two on a quest with Morgana to rescue a kidnapped Merlin, and so there's conflict, there's adventure. I will say the plot felt a little thinner than I thought it was going to be, and the romance, I would have liked to see it develop a little bit more. However, it may just be that I have been really conditioned for the slow burn of another graphic novel that I read this month that we will talk about in a little bit. It was a fun time. I wish it had gone a little further, but especially for young adult audiences, I do think it was satisfying and it was a good, quick read. Next, I read A Crane Among Wolves by June Her, which we did talk about in a Feature Friday, and this is her latest young adult historical fiction. It is a standalone set in 1506 Korea and takes place under the rule of a tyrant. And our protagonist, well, we have dual points of view in this book, as we discussed, but Isolde is trying to rescue her sister, who has been kidnapped by the king, and in this endeavor she both encounters a murderer and a mystery to solve that may allow her to save her sister, as well as a burgeoning coup connected to the half-brother of the king, Prince Taeyang, and the connection there. And so this bleeds together, or blends together, I should say, a lot of things that I've really enjoyed in her subsequent two books. I have said before, because I have not read her debut yet, but I have said before many times that I think that she is one of the strongest voices in young adult historical fiction right now. I stand by that. And this has a lot of the flavorings of both The Forest of Stolen Girls and The Red Palace, kind of in a new format, in that we have some of the romantic leanings of The Red Palace, though it is much more of a slow burn, as well as that government corruption, though a different time and a different ruler. And The Forest of Stolen Girls is also exploring corruption, but smaller government corruption. And all of them also have a mystery component. And so I very much enjoyed this installment in her body of work. And if you would like further thoughts about it, go ahead and check out that Feature Friday. Next, I read Craft, Stories I Wrote for the Devil by Ananda Lima, which is a collection of short stories that also has this connecting through line of the author and the way the author encounters the devil throughout her life. And we start with that first meeting and the way that that through line then kind of spurs these other short stories that kind of fork off of the main narrative, and the assumption that the narrator is the one writing these stories. And so the first interaction we see where the narrator, the writer, meets the devil mirrors the first short story pretty closely. And so it's interesting to see the differing point of view there and make me question as a reader then how much of the subsequent stories I as a reader am supposed to interpret as pulled from the writer's real life. And then we see them interacting or seeing the devil then throughout the rest of their life in these little fleeting glimpses. So short interactions. That first night was the most substantial interaction. And then within the actual short stories themselves, they do have that touch of the weirdness and the odd that I really enjoy, as you probably know, in my short stories, in my fiction, even more generally. It isn't as quite as biting as something like a Mariana Enriquez, but there's just something kind of off. And this idea of what you are haunted by in one of the short stories. There are a lot of cultural explorations as well, in combination with just what the devil represents in this, which I don't think I can fully articulate. However, I am very excited because when I first read this, I posted an Instagram and I said that I hoped that this would be programmed in Chicago's Printers Row Lit Fest, which is coming up next month, because I saw that the author does live in Chicago. And so I was like, well, there's a chance. And I would really love to see her talk about the craft of this book and just how she sees all of these pieces fitting together. And one of my favorite panels that I've ever sat in on at Printers Row was a panel about like odd fiction. And so I'm happy to report, though the full Printers Row Lit Fest schedule is not out yet, that I saw them post on their Instagram or post in their stories something from Lima that confirmed that she will be at Printers Row. So I am definitely going to keep my eye out for what that panel is going to be. I really want to make sure to try and catch that one if I can, and hopefully that schedule will be released sooner rather than later. We are in that period where I am just waiting for it to come out, and I feel like I do have a habit of getting frustrated by how late that schedule usually comes out, but I at least know that I have one thing to look forward to now. Next, this month I also started to get out of my audiobook funk, which is very exciting. Before I had kind of gone into my slump, I had started The Prospects by K.T. Hoffman that I was very much looking forward to, and I just couldn't focus, and I was so bummed about it. So I restarted The Prospects by K.T. Hoffman, and I am so excited to announce that it was my favorite listen of the month, hands down, and one of my favorite books of the month, I think. I really, really enjoyed this. I was charmed, it was fun, and I say this as someone who doesn't consider myself a sports person, and this is a book about minor league baseball, but I loved the exploration of these characters and these characters in relation to their relationships together, but also their relationships to the sport of baseball. And so in this we are following Gene, who is the first out trans baseball player, and he is being kind of upset in his season by the arrival of Lewis, who he used to play with during college, and they just had like a kind of breaking off. I don't know that they were ever super, super close in college, but they were at least friendly, and there was just some kind of break there. And so Gene is kind of dreading Lewis coming onto the team. It's not full like enemies to lovers energy, but there is some frustration there, combined with the fact that Lewis is going to be taking the position that Gene was hoping he would move into. And so there is a lot of tension, and that tension, when it comes to them on the field, is coming out in their game in a way that makes it so they are not winning. And this is further complicated by the fact that there was this assumption that Lewis would be going pro, or something had happened with that. This isn't a reflection on the book for me not being able to articulate that fully. That is just me probably not fully understanding all the dynamics of baseball within the kind of politics of things. And I will say that the author really does understand the sport of baseball and utilizes it very well in the book, but also strikes a nice balance where a reader like me, who may not know all of the nitty-gritty of the rules of baseball, despite the fact that two gentlemen at a White Sox game last summer did try to very kindly talk us through all of the new updates for last baseball season. However, I feel like I still very much was on the ride and understood, especially because this book taps into something that I can very much relate to without the sports element, in that we have a character in Gene who is so positive. He looks out for his teammates. He loves the sport that he plays so fully. He gets it honest. His father was a baseball player on the same team he plays for, and so he's always been very passionate about baseball. But he also has these hopes, both in his career and his personal life, that he is afraid to name, because to name them means putting them out in a way where he could be disappointed if they don't come true. And so I think that there's just this beautiful humanity and idea of wanting more for ourselves and allowing us to have those hopes and dreams that comes out both in Gene's game and the exploration of him as a baseball player that is very actively explored within the book, and also his relationship with Louise. And I recognize that I listened to this on audio and I'm not in this moment remembering if the narrator was pronouncing his name Louis or Louise, but I feel like it should be Louise. Anyway, in terms of these two and kind of shifting that dynamic, they agree to start practicing ahead of games together, or like putting in more time on the field to kind of sync up their game, and so they're not working against each other on the field, as well as their coach realizes that something is going on here and makes them room together. So we don't have a there's only one bad situation, but we do have that forced proximity. With Luis as well, there is anxiety representation and he has a service dog. So I was just utterly charmed by this one, and to give in to the baseball pun, it was a home run for me. Next, I was still working on finishing some of my rereads for my Wallflower romance recommendations video this month as well. So I reread Wicked and the Wallflower by Sarah MacLean, which is the first in the Bare Knuckle Bastards trilogy series. And this follows Devil and Felicity and is just a lot of fun. I love Sarah MacLean. If you want to hear me talk about this book a little deeper, go ahead and check out that Wallflowers recommendations video. But it essentially follows a kind of bargain that Felicity and Devil are making. We've got our Devil's bargain, lots of puns today, in which Felicity is trying to basically gain a duke, in that Felicity has basically spur of the moment, in an attempt to kind of show up a group of friends she has had a falling out with, declared herself engaged to a duke that she has never met. And Devil tells her that he can make this happen because he is going to be using it to enact revenge against this very same duke. So this is a kind of move into a darker territory for Sarah MacLean. I definitely think we got that in the Rules for Scoundrels series as well, which I always want to call the Fallen Angel series, which was my introduction to MacLean, but this series felt like a shift in some ways as well, and this was the start of that, as well as it being a fun Wallflower romance, so definitely something to check out. Additionally, I was kind of balancing between this copy, and this was the first time I had read this book since I read the advanced reader copy before it came out. And I realized there were a couple shifts in the text because I did still somehow have that digital arc. It just hadn't deleted off. And I was going back and forth between the two formats. And I did notice some slight differences in the text in a moment where I was kind of catching up where I was from one format to the other and shifting back and forth, and realized that this copy has a paragraph or a couple paragraphs in that chapter. I don't remember which one exactly, because it ultimately didn't change anything too significantly. It was just a couple of added paragraphs about Felicity's brother, I think, but that weren't in that arc. And it was just kind of making me think, because my thoughts and the way I interact with arcs and or request arcs has changed a lot since I started interacting with books and reviewing books on or in online spaces. And I feel like we've been having a lot of discourse start to pop up around arcs again. I mean, it's all kind of cyclical, and it may just be because I joined Threads last week, but it got me thinking, and I might have more to say about that in the future. I don't know, but let me know if you would be interested. Next, as part of the same project, I reread on audio this time The Wallflower Wager by Tessa Dare, which I also had not read since it came out, though this time the format switch up was in audio versus print, and I had forgotten how kind of quirky this was. I have been waiting a long time, it feels like, for the new Tessa Dare book, and I have given up hope on it, as I think I have articulated before, in a way where I just hope everything is okay with Tessa Dare. But that is more to say that I read this before I had read more of her body of work, notably at least a couple of the Spindle Cove books, because I don't think I've read the third one yet. I need to get on that. But kind of being able to track a little bit more actively some of the hallmarks of Tessa Dare, including like this quirkiness, the use of animals that is heavily involved here. And I won't lie, sometimes the cutesiness of the animals in this book this go around got a little tedious for me, especially because it shifts up. There is a kind of shift in the third act involving some trauma in our protagonist's past that is understandably linked to the way she is interacting with the world and the way that she is rescuing all of these animals and not really moving in society and finding her worth and her companionship there and what have you. It doesn't feel like it fully unpacks that, but it's definitely at play, and as a reader we can read that and recognize that in the situation. But at the same time, it is a big revelation and a tonal shift of sorts that is kind of discordant with the rest of the book, and so it's interesting to see how that's handled. I don't think it's done badly, it's just a little bit of a shock if you're not expecting it. That being said, on audio in particular, this really flies by, and I really did still have a fun time. Again, if you like that kind of quirky banter that feels a little lighter sometimes, this definitely tonally, I think if you do like Julia Quinn, which is part of the reason I included it in the Wallflower reading recommendations video, I definitely think that this may be of interest to you. Next, while I haven't been watching all of the Olympics by any means, I felt like I still needed to give a nod to the Olympic Games in some way, and I had completely forgotten somehow that Fence Volume 6 had come out. And so I read Fence Volume 6, and I was almost giddy reading this. It felt like it moved the plot. It felt like we jumped the plot along in some ways in comparison to the previous volume and even maybe Volume 4. It's been a second since I read it. Essentially, we got Seji and Nicholas alone in a scenario that was very date-like. I am still trying to reconcile, because the novels are feeling very alternate universe at this point, and so I'm trying to kind of figure out where that lies. Like, if they are AU to the comics, it seems like yes, but even so, it feels like we're moving on the comic front, and not just in relation to the slow burn of Nicholas and Seji, but in relation especially to fencing. And we get a little bit more interaction with Jessie here, who is Seji's rival and former friend, as well as Nicholas's secret half-brother. Jessie does not know this. And so it feels like it's setting up a lot more payoff that we have been waiting for, and I don't anticipate it necessarily coming to fruition in the immediate future, but it feels like the seeds that have been planted are growing in a more substantial, a little quicker way than they have in recent memory, and I'm just really excited and am getting a little impatient, I'm not gonna lie, but this was a good volume to follow up Volume 5 because it's kind of regained my interest. Also, I'm sorry about any noise interference that I may not be able to edit out of the final video. It always becomes the loudest when I sit down to try to film, because them's the breaks, right? But to finish up the month, because while we are getting back into the swing, it is a somewhat abridged month in terms of both number of books and thoughts on those books. I'm getting back in the flow here. But I also listened to A Novel Love Story by Ashley Poston, which is her newest romance with a kind of odd twist. Her concepts are great, and I must say, even though I didn't love The Dead Romantics and I haven't yet read The Seventh Year Slip, this one did work a little better for me. It wasn't perfect, but I did really enjoy what it was trying to do, and I went in not really knowing how I was going to respond to it, because it is kind of centered around the idea of small town romance and our protagonist basically getting pulled in to her favorite small town romance series. And additionally, it is an incomplete romance series, which is a really great parallel with our protagonist Elsie's current life, in that she is pulled into this fictional town in the first place because she is on her way to a cabin for a reading retreat with her book club, in which everyone else has had to cancel due to life circumstances, including her best friend, her childhood best friend, who is on her way to an international vacation with her boyfriend, where her boyfriend is about to propose. And this is forcing Elsie to kind of face, though she is trying to flee in this moment, her own current life in wake of her being jilted a couple of years ago by her fiance, and how she has or has not dealt with that. And in the process of this and attempting to get away for the week, she stumbles on this town. And not only does she stumble on this town that is filled with all of the things and the people that she so treasures and planned to spend the week with in a different capacity, but with a grumpy bookseller who has a right to be grumpy because she almost ran over him on her way into town, that doesn't belong in the original series. And so Elsie has to assume is the intended hero of the incomplete book, except they get over that initial conflict and grouchiness caused by her almost running him over when he offers her a place to stay as her car is getting worked on, and they grow closer over this time. However, this forces Elsie to consider if she is potentially ruining someone's happily ever after or complicating someone's happily ever after. And so there is a lot of interior work reflected there, and it's an interesting and kind of refreshing twist on the idea of kind of being pulled into your favorite book, whether you've encountered this trope like I did back in The Great Good Thing when I was a preteen, or in something like Lost in Austin. And it's pulling this fictional place into the real world in some ways, almost like a Brigadoon. I think this book is Brigadoon. However, the small town angle of it was initially what made me a little hesitant. I grew up in a small town, and so I have a complicated relationship with small town romances and the kind of portrayals of small towns, including in something like this, where she is talking with the bookseller of this small town. And at least in my small town, I don't know if there would be enough business to sustain a bookstore, especially knowing how hard the independent bookstore market is more generally. Granted, we are seeing a growth in indie bookstores across the country and into more communities, but in terms of what is considered a small town, I think my idea differs potentially a little bit from the fictional idea. However, it really did it in an interesting way because it really played in to the fantasy of it. It acknowledged that this was an escape for her in a lot of ways and pushed the boundaries of imagination in the sense that it had really fuzzy edges when it came to things that weren't described in the books. So they could be at whatever restaurant and reading a menu, but if that menu hadn't been described in the book, it looked just kind of blurry and vague. And I really liked that idea. I would be really interested to see that translated to the screen and how that would be interpreted. I think that would be really interesting. Now, I did respond to this book a little bit better, I think, too, because I had more buy-in with the central conceit. Don't get me wrong, I really loved the conceit of The Dead Romantics. I just had trouble kind of buying into the romance at the heart of that. And I know that that is a personal issue because I know a lot of people really, really loved that book. Here, I was willing to offer a little bit more grace in terms of the tropes kind of pushing things along. However, I do want to acknowledge that the tropes really were kind of pushing things along in a lot of places. You really did have to take a lot on faith in the relationship between these two characters. And similar to my critiques of the Dead Romantics, because again, I haven't read The 7-Year Slip yet, that felt sometimes like the relationship beats for our main couple were being pushed forward by what the plot necessitated or the idea that they needed to be at this point in the story rather than emotionally, organically getting to those places. And so the emotions of things didn't always read completely true to me in terms of whether the character would be at that emotional place at that particular time based on the action of the book. It felt like we were kind of pushing along because that's what the plot necessitated. But at the same time, I did have a really good time in this, and I do think I enjoyed it more because it was on audio potentially, because I could just kind of keep going with the flow of things. That's not to say there weren't a moment or two that did take me out of it. For instance, there was a moment where Elsie was chasing after someone at the diner, and she mentions putting down money to cover her food twice in a way where it didn't feel like a callback to the original, but it was stating it as if it was new information again and it just hadn't been caught in editing, which is fine. Like, I'm not going to blast an entire novel over like one editing oopsie, but it is something that took me out of the moment just a little bit. And clearly I have the most to say about this book, because also to talk about Elsie a little bit too, there were some times I had to kind of suspend my disbelief. I was a little frustrated with her at one point because a lot of her emotional journey is kind of reckoning with the fact that her very best friend is getting engaged and dealing with her complicated emotions surrounding that, which makes perfect sense. And I was glad to see that engaged with in some ways because she is kind of contending with this happiness for her friend and this major milestone, and also dealing with the idea and reflecting on the fact that her own engagement ended badly and with heartbreak. But the book seemed to be more focusing on the fact that she was feeling like they were always going to do things together and meet these milestones together, and there was no real way for Elsie to do that at that point. And at one point in the book, she is able to get cell service because it's also just understood within this world that she doesn't really have connection to the outside world. She gets cell service by accident at one point and gets a text from her best friend telling her she's engaged, and the response isn't as excited as you would think it would be, at least in pretending for your friend, even if you do have complicated emotions surrounding it. And so it felt, and I understand and I'm glad that we do acknowledge these complex feelings, and I do think characters should be allowed to be selfish and deal with more complex feelings. Where I struggled in this dynamic was this idea that they would be doing everything together, but she never really seems to acknowledge that her best friend may have been feeling the same when she was engaged, and that at the time that she was engaged and going to get married, she was also about to enter a new stage of life without her best friend. And she never really fully grapples with that piece of things. And so it felt again like that is just another reflection of how some of the emotional beats and emotional work, all of the groundwork was there, and I really loved what it was exploring, but I think that it could have pushed a little further in digging into that emotional truth instead of just forcing us emotionally where the plot beats needed to be. I wish it had just evolved a little bit more organically there, and I think we would have ended up in similar places, or very well could have ended up in similar places. There just would have been a little bit more depth. And with that, that is what I read in July. Maybe not as insightful as I have been in the past, but we probably needed a shorter video too, so I think it'll be okay. Let me know what you read in July, if you read any of these and had thoughts, or if you have thoughts from your own reading life. I would love to hear them. Thank you, as always, for hanging out and listening to my thoughts. I very much appreciate it. Go ahead and like and subscribe if you feel like it. It does help me out, but you are not obligated to help me out. But thank you for being here regardless if you are still here. Read something good, and yeah, bye.